The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Windsor Castle as King Charles III sat in his private study, surrounded by the weight of centuries of royal tradition. The mahogany desk before him was covered with state papers requiring his attention, each document bearing the seal that reminded him of the enormous responsibility resting on his shoulders. At 75, Charles had waited longer than any heir in British history to wear the crown, and now, 18 months into his reign, the pressures were beginning to show in ways that even his closest advisors couldn't fully comprehend. The king's daily routine had become increasingly demanding since his coronation. Every morning began at 6 with a review of government briefings, followed by audiences with ministers, meetings with Commonwealth representatives, and countless ceremonial duties that required his presence. The red boxes filled with state papers seemed to multiply overnight, each one demanding his careful consideration and signature. Charles took his constitutional role seriously, perhaps more seriously than any monarch before him, and this dedication was slowly taking its toll on his aging body. That particular Tuesday started like any other, with Charles reviewing the Prime Minister's latest proposal for economic reforms while sipping his morning tea. The Earl Grey steamed gently in the fine bone china cup that had belonged to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. These small traditions brought him comfort in a role that often felt overwhelming, connecting him to the long line of monarchs who had faced similar challenges in these same rooms. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, had noticed the king's increasing fatigue over the past few weeks. The monarch who once seemed to have unlimited energy for his environmental causes and architectural interests now appeared drawn and pale during their morning briefings. Charles had been pushing himself harder than usual, determined to prove that his reign would be meaningful and impactful, not just a brief interlude between his mother's historic tenure and his son William's eventual succession. The castle staff moved quietly through the corridors, each person aware of their role in maintaining the smooth operation of the royal household. Mrs. Angela Kelly, the king's trusted aide, had been with the royal family for decades and possessed an intuitive understanding of the monarch's moods and needs. She had observed Charles's growing tendency to work through meals and skip the brief rest periods that his doctors had recommended. Despite gentle suggestions from both staff and family members, the king remained determined to fulfill every aspect of his duties without complaint or compromise. As the morning progressed, Charles found himself struggling to concentrate on the documents before him. The words seemed to blur together, and he felt an unusual heaviness in his chest that he attributed to stress and lack of proper sleep. He had been experiencing these symptoms intermittently for several days, but had dismissed them as the natural result of his demanding schedule. The king was known for his reluctance to acknowledge physical discomfort, a trait inherited from his mother, who had famously continued her duties well into her 90s despite various health challenges. The transformation of Charles from Prince of Wales to king had been more jarring than anyone, including Charles himself, had anticipated. For over 70 years, he had prepared for this role, developing his own interests and causes while waiting in the wings. Environmental conservation, sustainable agriculture, traditional architecture, and interfaith dialogue had been his passions, areas where he could make a meaningful contribution without stepping on constitutional boundaries. Now, as king, these personal interests had to be balanced against the broader responsibilities of the crown, leaving him feeling stretched between his authentic self and his institutional role. Queen Camilla had become acutely aware of her husband's struggles during their private moments together. Having known Charles for decades, first as a friend, then as a partner, and now as his queen consort, she understood his personality better than perhaps anyone else in his life. She recognized the signs of his mounting stress in the way he rubbed his temples during meetings, the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking, and his increasing tendency to lose himself in thought during conversations. Their relationship had weathered extraordinary public scrutiny and personal challenges over the years. From their early friendship in the 1970s through the complicated decades that followed, including their respective marriages to other people, their eventual reunion, and their marriage in 2005, Charles and Camilla had developed a bond built on genuine understanding and mutual support. Camilla had never sought the spotlight that came with royal life, but she had embraced her role as Charles's companion and supporter with a grace that surprised even her critics. The queen consort's approach to royal duties differed markedly from that of her husband, where Charles felt the weight of every decision and the historical significance of each action. Camilla brought a more pragmatic and relaxed perspective to royal life. Her background, while privileged, had been more conventional than Charles's rarefied upbringing. She understood the rhythms of ordinary life in a way that helped ground the king when his sense of duty threatened to overwhelm his humanity. On this particular morning, Camilla had noticed Charles's pallor during breakfast but had chosen not to comment, knowing that he would likely brush off her concerns. She had learned over the years that direct confrontation about his health often led to stubborn resistance, while gentle observation and subtle care proved more effective in ensuring his well-being. Instead, she had arranged for his favorite lunch to be prepared and had quietly asked his secretary to ensure that his afternoon schedule included at least one brief break. The castle's medical staff, led by Dr. Douglas Glass, the royal physician, had been monitoring the king's health with increased attention since his accession to the throne. The stress of the new role, combined with Charles's advanced age, created a situation that required careful management. However, the king's reluctance to acknowledge any physical limitations made their job particularly challenging. Dr. Glass had been trying for weeks to convince Charles to undergo a comprehensive health assessment, but the monarch consistently postponed such appointments in favor of his royal duties. As the morning wore on, the symptoms Charles had been experiencing began to intensify. The chest tightness became more pronounced, and he found himself becoming dizzy when he stood too quickly from his desk. Still, he continued with his scheduled activities, meeting with the Canadian High Commissioner and reviewing plans for an upcoming state visit from the President of South Africa. His training in royal protocol ran so deep that the idea of canceling or postponing official duties due to personal discomfort seemed almost unthinkable. The king's determination to persevere despite his growing discomfort reflected the values instilled in him from childhood. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had been a perfect example of duty above all else, continuing her royal engagements even when her own health was declining. This example weighed heavily on Charles, who felt that any sign of weakness might be seen as a failure to live up to the standard she had set. The irony was that his very commitment to following her example was potentially undermining his ability to serve effectively in the long term. By midday, even the most observant members of the royal staff began to notice that something was amiss. The king's usual engagement during meetings seemed forced, and his responses to questions lacked their typical thoughtful precision. Sir Clive Alderton made a mental note to suggest a lighter schedule for the following day, though he knew such suggestions were often met with polite but firm resistance from his sovereign. The afternoon brought a particularly challenging series of meetings, including a sensitive discussion with government ministers about constitutional reforms and a private audience with several Commonwealth ambassadors. Charles prided himself on his preparation for such encounters, but found his concentration wavering in ways that left him feeling frustrated and concerned about his performance. The constitutional role of the monarch required not just presence, but active engagement, and Charles was beginning to fear that he was falling short of these requirements. As the day progressed toward its climactic moment, neither Charles nor Camilla could have predicted how dramatically their private world was about to intersect with the public image they had so carefully cultivated. The stage was set for a moment of vulnerability that would test not only their marriage, but also their understanding of what it truly meant to support one another in the unique circumstances of royal life. The events that were about to unfold would challenge everything the public thought they knew about Queen Camilla and reveal a strength of character that had been hidden beneath years of careful protocol and public restraint. In those crucial moments ahead, the woman who had been criticized and scrutinized for decades would show a side of herself that would surprise even those who thought they knew her best. The transformation was about to begin, triggered by a moment of crisis that no amount of royal training could have fully prepared them to handle. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the Persian carpet in the king's private sitting room as Charles attempted to review the final documents of his daily correspondence. His breathing had become increasingly labored, though he continued to convince himself that the discomfort was merely the result of a particularly stressful day. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily toward 3 o'clock, marking time in a room that had witnessed countless moments of royal history, though none quite like what was about to unfold. Queen Camilla had finished her own afternoon engagements, which included a meeting with the patrons of the National Osteoporosis Society and a review of upcoming charity commitments. Her approach to royal duties had always been more measured than her husband's, focusing on causes close to her heart rather than attempting to embrace every possible responsibility. This selective approach had actually made her more effective in her chosen areas, though she sometimes worried that Charles interpreted her boundaries as a lack of dedication to their shared role. As she made her way through the private corridors of Windsor Castle toward their shared sitting room, Camilla carried with her a growing sense of unease about Charles's condition. She had lived with him long enough to recognize the subtle signs that he was pushing himself beyond healthy limits. His laugh had been forced during lunch. His usual animated discussions about environmental policy had seemed mechanical, and she had noticed him gripping the arms of his chair more tightly than usual during their morning briefing. The Queen Consort's journey to understanding Charles's complex personality had taken decades. During their early friendship in the 1970s, she had been struck by his sensitivity and intelligence, qualities that made him fascinating company, but also left him vulnerable to the pressures of royal expectations. Over the years, she had watched him struggle with the gap between his private passions and his public duties, often serving as a bridge between these two worlds through her practical wisdom and emotional support. Their reunion in the 1990s, after both had experienced the breakdown of their first marriages, had been built on this deep understanding of each other's authentic selves. Camilla had never harbored ambitions for royal status, but she had recognized that her love for Charles was inseparable from accepting the unique challenges that came with his position. This acceptance had required her to develop a strength and resilience that few people fully appreciated, qualities that were about to be tested in ways she could never have anticipated. As Camilla approached the sitting room, she could hear Charles speaking in low tones to someone, presumably on the telephone. His voice carried a strain that immediately heightened her concern. She paused outside the door, not from any desire to eavesdrop, but because something in his tone suggested that he was struggling more than he wanted to admit. The conversation appeared to be with one of his private secretaries about rescheduling upcoming engagements, a topic that Charles typically approached with careful consideration for the impact on all parties involved. The king was indeed on the phone, attempting to negotiate a compromise regarding a planned visit to Scotland that would require extensive travel and a full day of public appearances. His chest felt increasingly tight, and he was finding it difficult to project the authority and confidence that such conversations typically required. The irony was not lost on him that his dedication to fulfilling his duties was potentially compromising his ability to perform them effectively, but this realization only added to his mounting frustration. Dr. Douglas Glass had been trying to reach the king for most of the afternoon, having received concerning reports from several staff members about the monarch's appearance and demeanor. The royal physician had learned to read between the lines when it came to the health of his royal patients, all of whom had been trained from birth to minimize any display of physical weakness. His attempts to schedule even a brief consultation had been politely deflected by the king's private secretary, who was caught between his duty to protect the monarch's time and his growing concern for the sovereign's well-being. The medical protocols surrounding the royal family were complex and carefully designed to balance privacy with the constitutional requirements of the monarchy. Any serious health issue affecting the king would have immediate implications for the line of succession and the functioning of government, making the management of royal health a matter of both personal and national significance. Dr. Glass understood these complexities, but was becoming increasingly frustrated by his inability to provide the care he believed his patient urgently needed. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, the castle staff were quietly discussing their observations of the king's condition. Mrs. Angela Kelly had worked with the royal family long enough to distinguish between ordinary fatigue and more serious concerns, and she had begun discreetly preparing for various contingencies without alarming other members of the household. Her experience during Queen Elizabeth II's final years had taught her the importance of being ready for rapid changes in royal health while maintaining absolute discretion about any concerns. The loyalty of the royal household staff extended far beyond their formal duties, encompassing a genuine care for the personal well-being of the family they served. Many of these individuals had dedicated their entire careers to royal service, developing relationships with family members that transcended the traditional boundaries between employer and employee. Their discretion was legendary, but their concern for Charles's condition was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal from one another. As Charles concluded his telephone conversation, he felt a sudden wave of dizziness that forced him to grip the edge of his desk for support. The sensation was more intense than anything he had experienced earlier in the day, accompanied by a tightness in his chest that made breathing difficult. For the first time, he began to acknowledge that his symptoms might represent something more serious than stress or fatigue. The realization brought with it a complex mixture of fear, frustration, and a reluctant acceptance that he might need medical attention. The king's training in emotional control, refined over decades of public scrutiny, enabled him to maintain his composure even as his physical condition deteriorated. However, this same training made it difficult for him to accurately assess the severity of his symptoms or to seek help when he needed it most. The institutional pressure to appear strong and capable was so deeply ingrained that even in private moments, Charles struggled to acknowledge vulnerability. Queen Camilla entered the sitting room just as Charles was attempting to stand from his desk chair, a movement that clearly caused him significant discomfort. Her trained eye immediately assessed the situation, taking in his pale complexion, the slight tremor in his hands, and the careful way he was moving. Years of experience with royal protocol had taught her to observe first and react second, a skill that would prove crucial in the moments that followed. The Queen Consort's approach to crisis management differed significantly from the traditional royal response of maintaining appearances at all costs. Her background outside the royal family had given her a more practical perspective on health and well-being, one that prioritized actual care over public perception. This difference in approach had sometimes created tension in her relationship with the institution, but it had also provided Charles with a partner who could see beyond the constraints of royal protocol to focus on human needs. As Charles turned toward her, Camilla could see the effort it took for him to arrange his features into a reassuring expression. The disconnect between his obvious distress and his attempt to appear normal struck her as both heartbreaking and dangerous. In that moment, she made a decision that would define not only the next few hours but also the public's understanding of her character and her relationship with her husband. The afternoon was about to take a dramatic turn that would test everything Camilla thought she knew about balancing royal duty with personal care. The woman who had spent years learning to navigate the complex requirements of royal life was about to discover that sometimes the most important protocol to break was the one that prevented authentic human connection. The stage was set for a revelation that would surprise everyone who thought they understood the dynamics of the modern royal marriage. The critical moment was approaching when all of Camilla's years of experience, her deep knowledge of her husband's character, and her own reserves of strength would be called upon in ways that no amount of royal training could have prepared her for. The true test of their partnership was about to begin, and it would reveal aspects of Queen Camilla's personality that even she might not have fully recognized until they were desperately needed. The moment that would change everything happened with surprising suddenness. As Charles attempted to move from his desk toward the window where afternoon light streamed through the ancient glass, his legs simply gave way beneath him. There was no dramatic flourish, no time for preparation or royal protocol. One moment the King of England was standing, and the next he was collapsing onto the antique carpet that had witnessed centuries of royal history, but nothing quite like this moment of profound vulnerability. Queen Camilla's reaction was immediate and instinctive, cutting through years of carefully learned royal behavior to reveal the woman beneath the title. Without a second's hesitation, she was on her knees beside her husband, her hands reaching for him with a tenderness that spoke of decades of private moments and shared intimacies that the public had never seen. In that instant, every bit of royal training, every lesson about maintaining dignity and composure in public, every carefully constructed barrier between private emotion and public duty simply disappeared. The Queen Consort's first words were not the measured, formal phrases that royal protocol might have suggested, but the urgent, loving concerns of a wife whose husband was in distress. Her voice carried a mixture of fear and determination that would have surprised anyone who knew her only through her public appearances. This was not the careful, diplomatic woman who appeared at state functions, but someone whose primary concern was the well-being of the man she loved, regardless of titles or constitutional implications. Charles remained conscious, but clearly in significant distress, his breathing shallow, and his complexion alarmingly pale. The chest pain that had been building throughout the day had intensified dramatically, and he found himself unable to speak coherently. His eyes sought Camilla's face, finding there the comfort and strength he needed even as his own physical capabilities seemed to be failing him. The vulnerability of the moment was profound for a man who had spent his entire life in positions of authority and public scrutiny. What happened next would become the defining moment of Camilla's public image, though it occurred far from any cameras or official observers. Rather than immediately calling for help or following the established protocols for royal medical emergencies, she simply held Charles, creating a pocket of intimacy and care in the midst of what could have been a devastating crisis. Her instinct was to provide emotional support first, understanding intuitively that her husband's greatest need in that moment was not medical intervention, but the assurance that he was not alone. The Queen Consort's response revealed aspects of her character that had been hidden beneath years of public scrutiny and careful image management. Her critics had often portrayed her as calculating and opportunistic, someone who had manipulated her way into royal status for personal gain. But her actions in this private moment showed a depth of genuine love and commitment that no amount of acting could have produced. Her concern was so complete and authentic that it transcended any consideration of how her behavior might be perceived or judged by others. As she held Charles, Camilla began speaking to him in low, soothing tones, the kind of intimate communication that had sustained their relationship through decades of challenges and changes. She told him that everything would be fine, that she was there with him, and that they would get through this together just as they had weathered every other difficulty in their long partnership. Her voice carried a calm authority that seemed to have an immediate stabilizing effect on his condition, demonstrating the deep emotional connection that had always been the foundation of their relationship. The practical side of Camilla's nature quickly asserted itself as well. While continuing to provide emotional support, she began assessing the situation and considering the steps that needed to be taken. Her experience as a military wife in her earlier years had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations, and this training proved invaluable as she balanced Charles's immediate needs with the broader implications of his condition. She understood that medical help would be necessary, but she was determined to manage the situation in a way that preserved his dignity and their privacy. The Queen Consort's decision to personally manage the immediate crisis rather than immediately involving the extensive royal medical and security apparatus reflected her deep understanding of her husband's psychology. She knew that Charles would be mortified by any suggestion that he was unable to fulfill his duties, and that the involvement of too many officials would only add to his distress. Her approach was to provide a buffer between his vulnerability and the institutional machinery that would inevitably swing into action once his condition became more widely known. After several minutes of providing comfort and assessing the situation, Camilla made the decision to call for Dr. Glass personally rather than going through the usual channels of private secretaries and protocol officers. This choice to handle the matter directly demonstrated both her practical nature and her determination to maintain control over how the situation unfolded. She understood that once the formal royal medical protocols were activated, Charles's condition would become a matter of state concern rather than a private family matter. Dr. Douglas Glass responded to Camilla's call with the urgency that the situation demanded, but he was also struck by the calm competence with which the Queen Consort managed the immediate crisis. Her description of Charles's symptoms was precise and medically useful, indicating that she had been observing his condition with the careful attention of someone who truly understood his normal state of health. Her ability to provide crucial medical information while maintaining emotional support for her husband impressed the royal physician and reinforced his respect for her judgment. The arrival of medical attention marked a transition from the purely personal dimension of the crisis to its broader implications. However, Camilla's management of this transition revealed yet another aspect of her character that had previously been hidden from public view. Rather than stepping back to allow the medical professionals to take control, she remained actively involved in Charles's care, asking informed questions and ensuring that his preferences and concerns were considered in all treatment decisions. The Queen Consort's behavior during these crucial moments demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the balance between supporting the institution of the monarchy and caring for the individual man who embodied that institution. She managed to honor both Charles's personal needs and his constitutional role, ensuring that appropriate medical care was provided while maintaining the privacy and dignity that both the situation and his position required. Her approach showed a level of political and personal intelligence that even her supporters had not fully appreciated. As Dr. Glass conducted his initial examination, Camilla remained close enough to provide emotional support while giving the physician the space he needed to work effectively. Her presence seemed to have a stabilizing effect on Charles, who visibly relaxed when she was near and became more anxious when she moved away. This dynamic revealed the extent to which their partnership had become essential to his emotional well-being, particularly during periods of stress or vulnerability. The medical assessment confirmed that Charles was experiencing significant cardiac symptoms that required immediate attention and ongoing monitoring. However, the king's condition had stabilized somewhat since Camilla's initial intervention, suggesting that her emotional support had provided genuine therapeutic value. Dr. Glass would later reflect that the Queen Consort's instinctive response to the crisis had likely prevented a more serious medical emergency by reducing Charles's stress and anxiety during the critical initial period. The question now became how to manage both Charles's medical needs and the broader implications of his condition for the monarchy and the government. This challenge would require all of Camilla's diplomatic skills and political intelligence as she worked to protect her husband's health while maintaining the stability and continuity that the institution of the monarchy required. The private woman who had just demonstrated such profound care would now need to become the public figure capable of managing a potential constitutional crisis. The afternoon had already revealed aspects of Queen Camilla's character that would fundamentally change how she was perceived by those who witnessed her actions. But the real test of her capabilities was just beginning, as the private crisis threatened to become a public matter with implications far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. The woman who had just shown such authentic love and competence in caring for her husband was about to discover whether these same qualities could be applied to protecting both him and the institution they served together. The transformation in Queen Camilla's approach to royal duty became even more apparent as the scope of Charles's medical crisis expanded beyond their private sitting room. Dr. Glass's preliminary assessment suggested that while the king's condition was serious, it was not immediately life-threatening if properly managed. However, this diagnosis brought with it a new set of challenges that would test every aspect of Camilla's character and capabilities. The woman who had just demonstrated such profound personal care was now faced with decisions that would affect not only her husband's health, but also the stability of the monarchy itself. The immediate question was how to manage Charles's care while maintaining the constitutional continuity that his role required.